The iron key turned in the lock with a sound that seemed to echo through every corridor of Greystone Keep, and Mara's eyes snapped open in the darkness of her cell, her heart already pounding before she fully understood why. She had been a prisoner for 3 weeks, ever since the border patrol caught her alone near the river, and in those 21 days, she had learned the rhythms of this place well enough to know that no one opened cell doors at midnight. The guard who stepped into the narrow beam of moonlight filtering through the high window was young, perhaps 25, with brown hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that held something she had not seen directed at her in months. Genuine concern, rather than contempt or fear. He wore the gray uniform of the Keep's garrison, but his hand trembled slightly as he pushed the door wider, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. "Run," he said, and the single word carried more weight than any speech. "I'll handle the rest." Mara sat up slowly on the stone bench that served as her bed, every muscle in her body coiled tight with suspicion and confusion. She was taller than most human women, with the broad shoulders and powerful build common to her people, and her green skin bore the fading bruises from her capture. Her tusks, small but unmistakable, caught the moonlight as she studied him with amber eyes that had seen too much cruelty to accept kindness at face value. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse. 3 weeks of silence broken only by interrogations, and the muttered curses of guards had left her wary of her own words. The guard glanced over his shoulder toward the corridor beyond, then back at her with an urgency that made his jaw tighten. "Because tomorrow they're going to execute you. The magistrates signed the order this evening. They're calling it justice for the raids last summer, but you weren't even part of those raids, were you?" "No," Mara said, and the word came out harder than she intended. "I left my clan 2 years ago. I wanted no part of the war anymore." "I know," the guard said, and those 2 words made her freeze. "I've been listening when they question you. You tell the same story every time and it never changes because it's true. But truth doesn't matter to Commander Voss. He wants an orc to hang and you're convenient." Mara stood slowly, her full height bringing her nearly eye to eye with the young guard, and she saw him swallow hard though he did not step back. That small act of courage, holding his ground when every instinct probably screamed at him to retreat from an orc who could break him in half, told her more about his character than any words could. "If I run and you're caught helping me, they'll execute you instead," she said. "Then don't get caught," he replied, and something that might have been a smile flickered across his face before dying in the weight of what they were both risking. "There's a supply wagon leaving at dawn for the southern villages. If you can reach the stables and hide in it, you'll be beyond the border by noon." "Why are you doing this?" Mara asked again, because she needed to understand, needed to know if this was mercy or some elaborate trap. The guard met her eyes, and in the moonlight she saw something raw and honest in his expression. "Because I joined the guard to protect people, not to murder innocents. Because I'm tired of this endless hatred. Because maybe if one person chooses different, it matters." He paused, then added more softly, "Because you deserve to live." Those last words struck something deep in Mara's chest, a place she had thought hardened beyond reaching. She had been called monster, savage, beast. She had been spat upon and beaten and locked in darkness. But this human guard with his trembling hands and frightened eyes looked at her and saw someone who deserved to live. "What's your name?" she asked. "Garrett," he said. "Garrett Rivers. But you need to go now before the next watch rotation." Mara moved toward the door, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, but she paused beside him. Up close she could smell sweat and fear on him, but underneath that was something else, something like pine soap and leather. He was risking everything for her, a stranger, an enemy by the laws of his people. "Thank you, Garrett Rivers," she said quietly. "I won't forget this." "Just survive," he replied. "That's thanks enough." She slipped past him into the corridor, every sense heightened to the point of pain. The keep was quiet in the dead hours of night, but quiet was not the same as empty. Guards patrolled the walls. Other prisoners shifted in their cells. One wrong sound, one unlucky encounter, and she would be back in chains with Garrett beside her awaiting the rope. The corridor stretched ahead in both directions, lit only by the occasional torch guttering in its bracket. Mara turned left because Garrett had positioned himself to guide her without words, his body language suggesting the path. She moved like water, her clan training from childhood making her steps soundless despite her size. Behind her, she heard Garrett moving the opposite direction, and she understood he was creating a distraction, drawing attention away from her escape route. The stairwell down from the cell block was narrow and steep, the stones worn smooth by centuries of feet. Mara descended quickly, her hands barely touching the walls to steady herself. At the bottom, she found herself in a storage level, racks of weapons and armor standing like silent sentinels in the darkness. She paused, torn. Weapons would help her survive the wilderness, but stealing them would make this escape unmistakably an inside job rather than some failure of security. She could not, would not, make Garrett's sacrifice meaningless by adding evidence against him. She continued empty-handed through a door that opened onto the keep's courtyard. Here the moonlight was both ally and enemy, illuminating her path, but also making her visible if anyone looked in the right direction. The courtyard was perhaps 50 yards across, with the stables built into the far wall. Between her and freedom lay open ground. Mara waited, counting heartbeats, watching the pattern of the guards on the walls. They moved in predictable circuits, each man pacing his section before turning back. There would be a moment, just a handful of seconds, when both guards would have their backs turned to the section of courtyard she needed to cross. She counted the pattern twice to be certain, then moved. Running across open ground felt like exposing her soul to the world. Every step seemed too loud, too visible, too impossible. The courtyard stones were rough under her feet and the night air cold on her skin through the thin prison shift she wore. But she ran with the strength of desperation and the grace of her people, and in 10 seconds she was pressing herself against the stable wall, lungs burning, heart hammering so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. No alarm sounded. No shout split the night. She had made it. The stable door was barred but not locked, and Mara lifted the heavy timber with muscles that had been built by years of hunting and fighting, before she had laid down her weapons and tried to find peace. Inside, the smell of horses and hay enveloped her, and she heard the animals shuffling nervously at the intrusion of an unfamiliar presence. "Easy," she whispered, though whether to the horses or herself she could not say. She found the supply wagon exactly where Garrett had said it would be, loaded and covered with canvas in preparation for the morning departure. Mara climbed into the back, burrowing beneath sacks of grain and wrapped bundles of goods, arranging them over herself until she was completely concealed. The space was cramped and dark and smelled of flour and dried herbs, but it was infinitely better than a cell or a noose. Time became strange in the darkness beneath the supplies. Mara could not see the sky or judge the passage of hours. She could only wait, forcing herself to breathe slowly and quietly, listening to the sounds of the stable around her. At some point, she heard voices, loud and angry, and recognized Commander Voss shouting about the escaped prisoner. Her muscles tensed, ready to fight if they found her, but the search moved elsewhere, and gradually the alarm faded into grim determination to catch her. Dawn came as a gradual lightening visible only through the gaps in the canvas cover. Mara heard someone approaching the wagon, then the creak of the driver's seat as someone climbed up. The horses were hitched to the wagon with the jingle of harness, and then with a lurch they were moving. The wagon rolled through the keep's gate, and Mara heard the guards questioning the driver. But whatever he said satisfied them, because after a moment the wagon continued without stopping. She felt the change as wheels moved from stone courtyard to dirt road, and only then did she allow herself to believe she might actually escape. The journey south took hours. Mara remained hidden, sweating in the enclosed space as the morning sun heated the canvas above her. Her body ached from the cramped position, but she dared not move enough to disturb the supplies covering her. Once the wagon stopped, and she heard voices, smelled cooking food, and realized they had paused at some roadside inn for the midday meal. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she stayed absolutely still, and eventually the wagon resumed its journey. It was well past noon, maybe approaching evening, when the wagon finally stopped, and the driver climbed down with a grunt. Mara heard him walking away, heard his voice growing distant as he called out to someone. She waited, counting to 100 twice, then carefully pushed aside the supplies covering her and peered out from under the canvas. They were at a crossroads in farming country, fields of wheat and barley stretching toward distant tree lines. The driver had stopped at a small trading post, probably to deliver part of his cargo. This was her chance. Mara slipped out of the wagon as quietly as she had entered it, staying low and moving quickly toward the nearest field. The wheat was waist-high, and she used it for cover, crouching low as she ran until she reached the tree line half a mile from the road. Only when she was deep among the pines did she stop, pressing her back against a tree trunk and finally allowing herself to shake with the fear she had been holding inside since midnight. She had escaped. Against all odds and probability, she was free. But freedom was not the same as safety. She was barefoot, wearing only a thin shift, without food or water or weapons, in a land where her green skin marked her as enemy to every human who saw her. The border with the disputed territories was still days of travel south, and between here and there lay farms and villages filled with people who would kill her on sight. Mara began walking south, staying within the forest, moving parallel to the road but never within sight of it. Her feet were tough from a lifetime spent outdoors, but the forest floor was harsh with stones and fallen branches. By the time darkness fell, her feet were bleeding and her body was shaking with exhaustion and hunger. She found a stream and drank deeply, the cold water shocking but necessary. Then she curled up beneath a fallen log, pulling dead leaves over herself for warmth, and tried to sleep despite the fear that every sound might be pursuers closing in. Morning came gray and cold, with mist hanging thick between the trees. Mara's whole body hurt, but she forced herself up and kept moving south. She found mushrooms she recognized as edible and ate them raw, then later discovered a blackberry thicket and gorged herself on the tart fruit, despite the thorns that tore at her hands and arms. 3 days passed in this way. Walking, hiding, scavenging whatever food the forest offered. Mara avoided all signs of human habitation, skirting wide around farms and once spending hours concealed in brush while a hunting party passed within yards of her hiding place. At night she shivered in whatever shelter she could find, and by day she pushed herself onward with the knowledge that capture now would mean death. On the 4th morning, she woke to find her left foot so swollen she could barely stand on it. Something had infected one of the cuts, and red lines were spreading up her ankle. Mara knew infection, had seen warriors die from less, and she knew she needed medicine or a healer or at minimum clean bandages and rest. But she was in the middle of enemy territory, and asking for help meant revealing herself. She struggled onward anyway, using a broken branch as a walking stick, her pace reduced to a painful hobble. The fever came that afternoon, turning the world distant and strange. She was no longer sure if she was walking south or in circles. The trees seemed to move when she was not looking. Once she thought she heard her mother calling her name, but her mother had died 5 years ago in a human raid on their village. Mara did not remember falling. She only knew that at some point the world tilted and the ground rushed up to meet her. And then there was nothing but darkness, and the sound of her own breathing getting slower and slower. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, and for a confused moment thought she was back in her clan's camp, before memory crashed back and she tried to sit up with a gasp of panic. "Easy," a voice said, and a hand pressed gently on her shoulder. "You're safe. You're burning with fever, but you're safe." Mara forced her eyes to focus and found herself looking at a small farmhouse interior, rough wood walls and a hearth where a pot bubbled. She was lying on a bed, a real bed with blankets, and her foot was bandaged with clean cloth. The hand on her shoulder belonged to Garrett Rivers. "How?" Mara managed, her voice a croak. "I deserted," Garrett said simply. "The morning after you escaped, I left, took a horse and supplies and rode south. I thought I might find you, or at least confirm you'd gotten away safely." "You left everything," Mara said, and even through the fever she understood the magnitude of what that meant. "Your position, your life, everything." "I couldn't stay there," Garrett said, and something in his voice was raw. "Not after I understood how corrupt it all was." "Commander Voss knew you were innocent, Mara. He knew, and he was going to hang you anyway because it looked good for the nobles who want to escalate the war. I couldn't serve men like that anymore." He brought her water and she drank, the cool liquid like salvation down her parched throat. "I found you yesterday evening," Garrett continued. "You'd collapsed about 2 miles from here. Your foot is badly infected, but I've been cleaning it and changing the bandages. This farmhouse is abandoned, has been for years since the war pushed through here. We should be safe for a few days while you heal." "You shouldn't have come after me," Mara said, but there was no strength in the words. She was too grateful, too relieved, and some part of her that she had thought dead was stirring back to life at the knowledge that someone had cared enough to follow. "Probably not," Garrett agreed. "But here we are." The fever kept Mara in its grip for 2 more days. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in dreams where past and present blurred together. Through it all, Garrett was there. He changed her bandages with gentle hands, spooned broth between her lips, laid cool cloths on her forehead when the fever peaked. He never touched her with anything but respect and care, and slowly, impossibly, the infection began to recede. On the 3rd morning in the farmhouse, Mara woke clear-headed for the first time. The fever had broken in the night, and she felt weak as a newborn, but finally, blessedly aware of her surroundings. Morning light streamed through gaps in the shutters, and she could hear birds singing outside. The bed beside her was rumpled where Garrett had been sleeping on top of the covers, maintaining propriety even in crisis. But he was not there now. Mara pushed herself up slowly, testing her strength, and found she could stand if she was careful. Her bandaged foot throbbed, but the pain was manageable. She made her way to the door, steadying herself against the wall, and opened it to find Garrett outside splitting wood for the fire. He looked up at the sound, and his face transformed with relief. "You're up," he said, setting down the axe. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a war party and then dragged behind their horses," Mara said, but she managed something that might have been a smile. But alive, thanks to you. Garrett helped her to a bench outside the farmhouse, and Mara sat gratefully in the sunshine. The farmhouse stood in a small clearing, with overgrown fields stretching away on all sides and forest beyond. It was isolated, peaceful, and dangerously close to the main road if Garrett's description was accurate. "We need to talk about what happens next," Garrett said, sitting beside her but maintaining a careful distance. "You're still too weak to travel far, but we can't stay here indefinitely. Patrols come through sometimes, checking the abandoned homesteads." "Where will you go?" Mara asked. "You can't go back north. They'll arrest you for desertion." "I know," Garrett said quietly. "I thought maybe south, across the border. There are settlements in the disputed territories that don't care much about the war. I could find work, start over." "That's Orc territory," Mara pointed out. "A human trying to settle there might not be welcome." "About as welcome as an Orc trying to travel through human lands," Garrett said with a slight smile. "We're quite a pair." They sat in silence for a moment, and Mara felt the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Finally, she said, "Why did you really come after me, Garrett?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The night I let you out of that cell, something changed in me. I realized I'd been sleepwalking through my life, doing what was expected, following orders, never questioning whether any of it was right. You were the first truly right thing I'd done in years, and after you left I couldn't go back to pretending. I needed to know you'd survived. I needed to help you get somewhere safe, and maybe—" He paused, then continued more softly, "Maybe I needed to believe that there was still goodness possible in this world, even between enemies." Mara looked at him, this human who had given up everything to save her, and felt something shift in her chest. "We're not enemies," she said. "No," Garrett agreed, meeting her eyes. "I don't think we are." Over the following days, as Mara's strength gradually returned, they fell into a rhythm of shared survival. Garrett hunted rabbits and gathered vegetables from the overgrown garden, while Mara sorted through the abandoned farmhouse for anything useful. They found old clothes that Mara could wear, tools that still had some life in them, and a small cache of supplies the previous owners had left behind. Garrett proved surprisingly competent at frontier living. He could start a fire with flint and steel, knew which plants were edible, and moved through the forest with reasonable quiet. Mara learned he had grown up on a farm before joining the Guard, and those early years had given him skills that served them well now. For her part, Mara contributed knowledge of tracking, hunting, and survival that went beyond what Garrett knew. She showed him how to move through the forest without leaving obvious signs, how to read weather in the behavior of animals, how to find water even in seeming wasteland. They taught each other, and in the teaching began to truly see one another. One evening, perhaps a week after Mara had first woken in the farmhouse, they sat by the fire after their meal, and Garrett asked the question that had clearly been on his mind for days. "Why did you leave your clan?" He said, "You mentioned it in the cell, but I never learned the full story." Mara stared into the flames, gathering her thoughts. "My clan was one of the war parties that raided human settlements," she began slowly. "For years, it was all I knew. We were told humans were the enemy, that they had taken our lands and killed our people, and that we were just taking back what was ours. And there was truth in that. Humans did push into our territories. There were massacres and burnings and atrocities on both sides." She paused, remembering. "But 2 years ago we raided a small farm, just a family, a husband and wife and 3 children. The man tried to fight and my brother killed him. The woman begged for her children's lives, and my clan leader, my own uncle, said to kill them all. He said leaving survivors just meant future enemies." Garrett said nothing, but she felt him listening with complete attention. I couldn't do it, Mara continued. I stood between my clan and that family, and I said no. I said we had taken enough, that we were becoming exactly what we claimed to hate. My uncle said I was a coward and a traitor. My brother said I had dishonored our mother's memory. They cast me out that night, and I've been wandering ever since, trying to find somewhere I could just live in peace. You saved that family, Garrett said quietly. I tried to, Mara replied. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if they survived the war after that, but I couldn't be part of the killing anymore. I thought maybe if I just found somewhere remote enough, far enough from the fighting, I could build a life. But there is nowhere far enough, is there? The hatred reaches everywhere. Maybe it does, Garrett said. But maybe every person who steps away from it matters. Maybe it starts with just a few people choosing different and then a few more, until eventually the balance tips. Mara looked at him, this idealistic human who had risked everything on principle. Do you really believe that? I have to, Garrett said simply. Otherwise all of this is meaningless. As the days passed into weeks, something began to grow between them that neither quite acknowledged but both felt. It lived in the small moments. Garrett laughing at a joke Mara made, Mara catching herself watching him work, the way they had begun to move around each other with easy familiarity, the quiet comfort of shared silence in the evenings. But underneath, the growing connection ran currents of fear and uncertainty. They were from peoples who had been enemies for generations. Their entire world would see their friendship as betrayal, and anything more than friendship as an abomination. The weight of that history sat between them even as they drew closer. One morning, Mara woke to find Garrett already up, standing at the edge of the clearing with tension in every line of his body. She joined him quickly, alert for danger. Smoke, Garrett said, pointing south. A lot of it. Either a large campfire or a building burning. They watched the distant smoke for several minutes, and Mara felt her heart sink as she recognized the location. That's coming from the Fletcher farm, she said. I passed near there on my way north before I was captured. There was a family there, older couple with a daughter. We should check on them, Garrett said immediately. We don't know if it's raiders or an accident, Mara cautioned. If it's raiders and they are still there, we're walking into danger with no weapons but a hunting bow. And if it's a family that needs help and we do nothing, can either of us live with that? Garrett countered. Mara looked at him and saw her own thoughts reflected back. They had both turned away from their people's wars because they could not stomach the innocent suffering. How could they ignore it now? We go carefully, Mara said. Scout first, act second. They approached the Fletcher farm through the forest, moving quietly and staying low. As they got closer, the smell of smoke grew stronger and they began to hear sounds. Shouting, crying, the whinny of frightened horses. Mara and Garrett crept to the edge of the tree line and looked out at devastation. The farmhouse was burning, flames consuming the wooden structure and sending black smoke into the sky. In the yard, 3 men in the rough leathers of border bandits were loading goods onto a wagon while a 4th held an elderly man and woman at knife point. A young woman, probably their daughter, lay motionless on the ground nearby, blood staining her dress. Border bandits, Garrett whispered grimly. Not soldiers from either side, just opportunists who prey on anyone weak enough. 4 of them armed, Mara assessed. The man holding the couple has a knife. The others have swords. We have a bow with 6 arrows. I can use the bow, Garrett said, but I'm not good enough to guarantee I won't hit the hostages. Then we make them move, Mara said, a plan forming. I'll circle around, come at them from the south, visible and alone. When they chase me, you take the shot at whoever stays with the hostages. That's using you as bait, Garrett protested. I'm an orc, Mara said flatly. They'll see me as an easy target and a chance to prove themselves. Their arrogance will make them sloppy. Garrett looked like he wanted to argue, but he could not deny the logic. "Be careful," he said instead, with an intensity that made something warm unfurl in Mara's chest. "Always," she replied, and slipped back into the forest to circle around. Mara approached from the south, emerging from the trees and walking openly toward the burning farm. It took only seconds for one of the bandits to spot her. "Orc," the man shouted, pointing. "There's an orc." The three men loading the wagon abandoned their work and drew their weapons, advancing on Mara with the cocky confidence of men who had never met real resistance. The fourth bandit, the one holding the elderly couple, hesitated, torn between his hostages and this new threat. "Look at this," one of the approaching men laughed. "Some monster bitch wandered right into our hands. Boss will pay good coin for an orc slave." Mara let them get closer, judging distances and timing. She needed to pull them far enough from the hostages that Garrett would have a clear shot, but not so far that she lost the element of surprise. When they were perhaps 20 yards from the couple, she stopped and called out. "I don't want trouble," she said, deliberately keeping her voice meek, playing into their expectations. "I'm just passing through." "You're not passing anywhere," the lead bandit sneered, "except into chains." They rushed her then, and Mara moved. She had spent years as a warrior before she laid down her weapons, and those skills had not faded. She sidestepped the first man's clumsy sword swing, grabbed his wrist and twisted hard. Bones snapped and he screamed. She used his body as a shield against the second man's attack, then shoved the first man into the second, sending them both stumbling. The third man was smarter, hanging back and trying to circle her. But while he was focused on Mara, he had forgotten about threats from other directions. Garrett's arrow took him in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain and surprise. The bandit holding the hostages made the mistake of looking away from his captives to see what the commotion was. The elderly man, braver or more desperate than the bandit expected, drove his elbow back into the bandit's stomach. It was not much, but it was enough. The bandit's grip loosened and the elderly woman wrenched away. Garrett's second arrow took the bandit in the leg, bringing him down. The remaining two bandits, seeing their companions injured and facing an orc who fought like a demon and an unseen archer, made the calculation that fleeing was better than dying. They ran for their horses, mounted clumsily, and galloped away east without looking back. Mara stood in the yard, breathing hard, as Garrett emerged from the forest with the bow ready in case any bandits returned. The elderly couple clung to each other, looking stunned, while Mara rushed to the young woman lying on the ground. "She's alive," Mara called out with relief, finding a pulse. Knocked unconscious, but alive. Between them, Mara and Garrett managed to stabilize the immediate situation. The farmhouse was a total loss, burned to its foundations, but they helped the family gather what possessions the bandits had not yet loaded onto their wagon. The young woman, whose name was Elizabeth, woke with a terrible headache but no serious injury. The elderly couple, Thomas and Mary Fletcher, looked at Mara with a mixture of fear and gratitude that she found painfully familiar. "You're an orc," Thomas said, stating the obvious. "I am," Mara confirmed, "but I'm not your enemy, neither is Garrett. We heard the attack and came to help." "You saved our lives," Mary said softly. "You and the young man both, thank you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. How many times had Mara dreamed of being seen as something other than a monster? How many times had she imagined humans looking at her with gratitude instead of hatred? They helped the Fletchers load their surviving possessions onto the bandits' wagon, which Garrett pointed out was now theirs by right of combat. The family had cousins in a village 10 miles east, and Thomas said they would head there and try to rebuild. Before they left, Mary approached Mara with something wrapped in cloth. "This was my mother's," she said, pressing it into Mara's hands. "It's not much, but I want you to have it." Mara unwrapped the cloth to find a simple silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a bird in flight. It was the kind of gift worth more for its sentiment than its material value, and Mara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I can't take this," she protested. "You can and you will," Mary said firmly. "You gave me back my family. That's worth more than silver." She paused, then added more softly, "I was wrong about your people. Or at least, wrong to think you were all the same. You're a good person, Mara. Don't let the world tell you different." The Fletcher family left in their wagon, heading east toward safety and family. Mara and Garrett watched them go, and when they were alone again, Garrett said, "You were right." "About what?" Mara asked. "About it mattering. Choosing different. Maybe one family at a time, one act of kindness at a time, the world changes." They walked back to their farmhouse in comfortable silence. But Mara was intensely aware of Garrett beside her, of the way he had trusted her plan, followed her lead, risked himself to help strangers. And she was aware of how he had looked when he thought she might be in danger, the fear in his eyes when the bandits rushed her. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Mara found herself studying Garrett's profile in the flickering light. He was not classically handsome, but there was something in the strong line of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the capable steadiness of his hands that made her heart beat faster. And the realization that she was falling for this human man terrified her more than any battle ever had. "Garrett," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. He looked at her, and something in his expression said he knew what was coming, had been waiting for it, maybe even hoping for it. "Yes." "What are we doing?" Mara asked. "This, us living here together. What is this?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, then said carefully, "What do you want it to be?" "I don't know if I'm allowed to want anything," Mara replied honestly. "My people would see this as betrayal. Your people would see it as perversion. There's no place in the world for someone like me to care about someone like you." "Then maybe we make our own place," Garrett said. He shifted closer, not touching but near enough that Mara could feel the heat of him. "I know this is complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this shouldn't happen. But Mara, I can't stop thinking about you. I lie awake at night listening to you breathe and feeling grateful you survived. I watch you move through the world with such strength and grace, and I think about how brave you were to stand up to your clan, how kind you were to that family today, despite everything your people and mine have done to each other. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, the world being wrong doesn't matter as much as us being right." Mara's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such raw honesty and vulnerability. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, but of what wanting you means. I'm afraid of being hurt again. I'm afraid of hoping for something impossible." "I'm afraid too," Garrett said. "But I'm more afraid of pushing you away because I was too scared to take a chance on something real." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull back, and took her hand in his. His hand was smaller than hers, more delicate, but it held hers with steady strength. Mara looked down at their joined hands, green skin against pale, and felt tears prick her eyes. "I care about you," she said, the words barely above a whisper. "More than I should, more than is wise." "Then be unwise with me," Garrett replied. "We've already given up everything else. Why not take this one thing for ourselves?" Mara looked up and met his eyes, and in them she saw the same longing, the same fear, the same desperate hope that she felt. Slowly, giving him the same chance to retreat that he had given her, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative, flavored with uncertainty and wonder. Garrett's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek with infinite tenderness. Mara's tusks made the angle slightly awkward, but they adjusted, learning each other, and when they finally pulled apart they were both breathing hard. "Well," Garrett said, and his voice shook slightly. "That was worth it," Mara finished. "Definitely worth it." They sat by the fire until late that night, talking about everything and nothing, stealing kisses between words, learning the shape of this new thing between them. And when they finally went to bed, Garrett pulled Mara close and held her while she slept, and for the first time in years Mara felt truly safe. The next morning brought reality crashing back. They were still fugitives in hostile territory, still without real resources or a long-term plan. But now they faced it together, and that changed everything. "We can't stay here much longer," Garrett said over breakfast. "Eventually someone will come looking for the Fletchers or investigating the smoke. We need to move on." "South," Mara agreed. "Across the border into the disputed territories. It's not safe there either, but at least we'll have a better chance." They spent the day gathering supplies and preparing for the journey. Garrett salvaged tools from the farmhouse, and Mara made a rough map based on her memory of the territory. By evening they had packs ready and a plan for the route. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Garrett said, "I don't know what happens next. I don't know if we can find a place that will accept us. But whatever comes, I want to face it with you." "Together," Mara agreed and sealed it with a kiss. They set out at dawn, moving south through forest and field, avoiding roads and settlements. The journey was hard, made harder by the constant need for caution, but they had each other, and that made all the difference. At night, they made cold camps or took shelter in abandoned buildings, and always they kept watch for patrols or bandits or anyone who might threaten them. A week into the journey, they were following a game trail through dense forest when Garrett suddenly stopped, his hand going up in warning. Mara froze, listening, and heard what he had. Voices ahead, speaking in the harsh consonants of the Orcish language. They crept forward carefully and found themselves looking down into a small valley where a group of orcs had made camp. There were perhaps a dozen of them, all warriors by their bearing, and Mara's heart sank as she recognized the markings on their gear. This was a war party from the Broken Axe clan, one of the most aggressive groups still fighting humans. "We need to go around," Mara whispered. "If they find us, they'll kill you on sight, and probably me too for traveling with a human." But as they started to retreat, Mara heard something that made her blood run cold. A child crying. She looked back at the camp and saw a small figure huddled near one of the tents, a human child no more than 6 or 7 years old, clearly a captive. "No," Garrett breathed beside her, seeing what she saw. "They have a child." "We can't do anything," Mara said, though the words tasted like ash. "There are too many of them. We'd be killed before we got close." "We have to try," Garrett insisted. "That's someone's son or daughter, Mara. We can't just leave them." Mara looked at the camp, at the warriors, at the impossible odds, and then at Garrett's face, set with determination and desperate compassion. She remembered standing between her clan and a human family, remembered the choice that had cost her everything but given her herself back. And she knew with absolute certainty that they were going to do something incredibly stupid. "We need a plan," she said. "Something better than just rushing in." They watched the camp for hours, learning the patterns of the guards, the layout of the tents where the child was being kept. As night fell, the orcs built up their fire, and most of them gathered around it to eat and drink. The child was left in a tent at the edge of the camp, presumably locked or tied inside. "The guards change at midnight," Mara whispered. For about 5 minutes, While they're switching and reporting, that corner of the camp will be less watched. If we can get to the tent during that window, cut through the back and get the child out, we might make it back to the forest before anyone notices. And if they notice sooner? Garrett asked. Then we run and hope we're faster, Mara said grimly. But I won't leave that child there. Neither will I, Garrett agreed. They waited for midnight with tension coiling tighter and tighter in their chests. Mara mentally reviewed every step of the plan, every point where things could go wrong, every contingency she could think of. Beside her, Garrett checked and rechecked his bow, preparing arrows within easy reach. Midnight came with the changing of the guard. The two orcs who had been on watch walked back to the fire to report, and the two replacements moved out to their positions but had not yet settled into their routine. It was now or never. Mara and Garrett moved down the slope like shadows, using every scrap of cover, taking advantage of every moment when the guards looked away. They reached the back of the tent, and Mara used her knife to slice through the leather wall. Inside they found the child, a little boy, tied hand and foot and gagged, eyes wide with terror. Garrett cut the boy's bonds while Mara kept watch. The child made a sound of fear when he saw Mara's green skin and tusks, and she could not blame him. But Garrett whispered urgently, "She's a friend. We're here to save you, but you have to be very, very quiet." The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face, and let Garrett pick him up. They slipped back out through the cut in the tent and started toward the forest. They were perhaps halfway there when someone shouted behind them, "Escape!" "The prisoner is escaping." The camp erupted into chaos. Warriors grabbed weapons and torches, and suddenly the night was full of shouting orcs and searching lights. Mara and Garrett ran, no longer trying for stealth, just speed. Behind them, the orcs gave chase. "Keep going." Mara shouted to Garrett, "Get him to safety." "Not without you," Garrett shot back. They crashed into the forest with the war party behind them, close enough that Mara could hear their footsteps and enraged shouting. An arrow hissed past her ear. Another thudded into a tree trunk beside Garrett. Mara knew these forests better than the broken axe warriors, had spent weeks learning this territory. She led them on a twisting route through dense undergrowth and treacherous terrain, using every trick she knew to slow their pursuers. But the orcs were relentless and more numerous, and slowly they began to close the gap. They burst out of the forest onto the bank of a river, dark water rushing past in the moonlight. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Ahead, only the river and the unknown forest beyond. "Can you swim?" Garrett asked the boy, who nodded fearfully. "Then we go through," Mara decided. "The current is strong, but it's our only chance." They plunged into the cold water, gasping at the shock of it. The river was deeper and faster than Mara had hoped, and the current immediately grabbed them and swept them downstream. She kicked hard, keeping her head above water, saw Garrett struggling to hold the boy and swim at the same time. Arrows splashed into the water around them as the war party reached the river bank. Mara heard shouting, arguing, and understood some of the orcs wanted to follow while others thought it was too dangerous in the dark. The current swept them around a bend and the voices faded behind them. The river carried them for what felt like miles, battering them against rocks, dragging them under and spitting them back up. Mara's lungs burned and her muscles screamed, but she kept fighting, kept swimming, kept watching for Garrett and the boy in the darkness. Finally, the current began to slow and Mara saw a sandbar ahead. She struck out toward it with the last of her strength, felt her feet touch bottom, and dragged herself onto the sand. Garrett appeared a moment later, still holding the boy, both of them coughing and gasping. They lay on the sandbar for long minutes, too exhausted to move, just grateful to be alive. The boy cried softly and Garrett held him, murmuring reassurances. Mara forced herself up and looked around, trying to orient herself. They were far from the orc camp, far enough that pursuit would be nearly impossible in the dark. They had made it. "We need to find shelter," Mara said when she could speak again. "Get dry and warm before hypothermia sets in." They staggered into the forest on the far side of the river and found a hollow beneath the roots of a massive fallen tree. It was barely large enough for the three of them, but it was dry and sheltered from the wind. Garrett stripped off his wet shirt and wrapped it around the boy, then pulled the child close, sharing body heat. Mara pressed close on the boy's other side, and together they created enough warmth to stop the worst of the shivering. The boy fell asleep eventually, exhausted by fear and the ordeal, and only then did Mara and Garrett look at each other in the darkness. "That was the most foolish thing we've ever done," Mara whispered. "Probably," Garrett agreed, "but we couldn't leave him." "No," Mara said, "we couldn't." They held each other and the sleeping child through the rest of the night, and when morning came they were stiff and sore but alive. The boy woke slowly, looking up at them with confusion that gradually cleared into memory. "You saved me," he said, his voice small and wondering. "What's your name?" Garrett asked gently. "Thomas," the boy said. "Thomas Miller. The orcs took me when they raided our farm. They killed my pa and they took me." "I'm sorry," Mara said, and meant it with all her heart. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her green skin and tusks and pointed ears, and Mara braced herself for the fear and hatred she expected. But instead the boy said, "You're an orc, but you saved me from the other orcs." "Not all orcs are the same," Mara said carefully. "Just like not all humans are the same, some of us choose to be better." "My pa said orcs were monsters," Thomas said, "but you're not a monster. You're nice." The simple, childlike acceptance nearly broke Mara's composure. She blinked back tears and managed to say, "Thank you, Thomas. That means more than you know." They shared what little food remained in their packs, then set out to find Thomas's home, or at least some settlement where he would be safe. The boy told them his farm had been north of where they were now, maybe 2 days' walk, and there was a village called Millbrook, another day beyond that where his aunt and uncle lived. The journey back north felt surreal, retracing steps through territory they had fought so hard to cross, but they could not simply abandon Thomas in the wilderness. They moved carefully, always alert for danger, and when they had to pass through areas where Mara might be seen, she hung back and let Garrett take Thomas forward while she paralleled them through the forest. 3 days later they stood on a hill overlooking Millbrook, a small farming village clustered around a mill and a stone bridge. Smoke rose from chimneys and people moved through the streets, going about their lives in blessed normalcy. "Your aunt and uncle live there," Garrett confirmed. Thomas nodded. "Uncle William and Aunt Sarah. They live in the house with the red door near the mill." "Then that's where we'll take you," Garrett said. They waited for evening when the light would be dimmer and there would be fewer people about. Then Garrett and Thomas approached the village while Mara waited in the forest, watching from a distance with her heart in her throat. She saw them enter the village, saw people point and stare at the bedraggled man and boy. She saw them knock on a door painted red, saw it open, saw a woman's shocked face, and then heard her cry of joy even from this distance. Thomas was swept inside by people who loved him, who had thought him lost, and Mara felt a fierce satisfaction despite the ache of being excluded. Garrett emerged from the house perhaps half an hour later and walked back toward the forest. Mara met him at the tree line and he took her hands in his. "He's home," Garrett said. "Safe with family." They were weeping with joy. His aunt asked who had saved him and brought him back, and I told her some of it. I didn't mention you were an orc, just that a brave woman had risked everything to help. "Does she believe you?" Mara asked. She wanted to meet you to thank you, Garrett said. But I explained that you were shy and had already left. She asked me to give you this. He pressed something into Mara's hand, and she looked down to find a silver coin and a small carved wooden bird, painted bright blue. The bird was rough, clearly made by a child, and Mara understood immediately that it was Thomas's own work, his way of saying thank you. He made that for you, Garrett confirmed. Said the bird reminded him of you because you were brave and free and you flew into danger to save him. Mara closed her hand around the little carved bird and felt tears spill down her cheeks. In her whole life, she had been called many things, but never brave and free, never seen as something beautiful and worthy of gratitude by a human child. "I'll treasure this," she said. They left Millbrook behind and continued south again, returning to their original plan of crossing into the disputed territories. But something had changed in both of them. They had risked everything twice now to help others, had proven to themselves that there was still goodness worth fighting for in the world. A week later, they crossed the border into the disputed territories, where neither human nor orc held complete control, and the laws of both peoples blurred into something more flexible. Here, in the borderlands, were settlements of mixed peoples, outlaws and refugees, deserters from both sides of the war who had chosen survival over ideology. They found a town called Crossroads, built at the junction of two trade routes, where humans and orcs, and even a few dwarves and halflings lived in uneasy but functional coexistence. It was rough, dirty, and lawless by the standards of either kingdom, but it was also free in a way neither Mara nor Garrett had experienced before. In Crossroads, no one looked twice at an orc woman and a human man walking together. They were just two more refugees in a town full of people trying to build new lives from the wreckage of the old. They found work at an inn called the Broken Shield, Mara as security and Garrett as general labor. The pay was poor and the work was hard, but it was honest and it was theirs. They rented a small room above the inn stable, one bed and four walls and a window that looked out on the street, and it felt like a palace compared to their weeks on the run. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn and autumn toward winter. Mara and Garrett fell into a rhythm of work and life, building something that felt almost like normalcy. They were careful in public, aware that while Crossroads was more tolerant than most places, there were still those who might take offense at their relationship. But in private, in the safety of their small room, they were free to be themselves. One evening, as the first snow began to fall outside their window, Garrett pulled Mara close and said, "I want to marry you." Mara stilled in his arms, hardly daring to believe what she had heard. "Marry." "I know there's no official who would perform the ceremony," Garrett said quickly, the words tumbling out. "And I know our peoples would never recognize it. But Mara, I love you. I want to promise you forever in whatever way we can. I want the world to know that you're mine and I'm yours, and that nothing is going to change that." Mara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I love you too," she said, and heard her voice break on the words. "I never thought I would be allowed to love anyone, let alone be loved in return. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Garrett Rivers. Yes, I will marry you in whatever way we can." They found a priest in Crossroads, an elderly human who had left his temple in disgust at the war, and now ministered to the refugees and outcasts of the borderlands. He listened to their story and agreed to perform a ceremony, blessing their union in the sight of whatever gods might care about two people trying to find happiness in a broken world. The ceremony was simple, held in the priest's small chapel with only the innkeeper and his wife as witnesses. Mara wore a simple dress borrowed from the innkeeper's wife, and Garrett wore the best clothes he could afford, which was not much. But when they stood before the priest and promised to love and honor each other for as long as they lived, it felt like the most important moment of Mara's life. "You may kiss your bride," the priest said with a smile, and Garrett pulled Mara close and kissed her with such tenderness and joy that she felt her heart might burst. They celebrated with a small feast at the inn, and for one night Mara allowed herself to simply be happy, to believe that maybe they really could build a life together here. Winter came in earnest, and with it came hardship. Food grew scarce and expensive. The cold was brutal, and many in Crossroads struggled to survive. But Mara and Garrett had each other, and that made all the difference. They huddled together on the coldest nights, shared what food they had, and told each other stories of better times to come. In early spring, news reached Crossroads that changed everything. The human kingdoms and the orc clans had agreed to a ceasefire, the first real pause in the fighting in a generation. It was not peace, not yet, but it was a chance for peace, and the borderlands began to hope that maybe the worst was over. With the ceasefire came opportunity. Refugees who had been trapped in the borderlands began to cautiously move back toward their homelands. Soldiers returned to their families. And in the chaos of reorganization, new possibilities opened up for people willing to take risks. Garrett heard about unclaimed land in the far southern territories, homesteads abandoned during the war that the new Joint Council was offering to anyone willing to work them. It was hard land, isolated and difficult, but it would be theirs if they could make it productive. "What do you think?" Garrett asked Mara as they discussed the opportunity. "Would you want to try to have our own place, build our own farm?" Mara thought about it, imagined a piece of land that belonged to them, a home they could build with their own hands, a life free from the constant wariness of living in town. "Yes," she said, "let's do it." The journey south took them through territory that was slowly healing from the war. They saw burned villages being rebuilt, fields being replanted, and everywhere people trying to piece together lives from the fragments left behind. It was not easy or simple, but it was happening, and that gave Mara hope. The homestead they claimed was in a valley between two forested ridges, with a stream running through it and good soil beneath the weeds. The cabin was half ruined, the fields overgrown, and everything needed work, but it had potential. More importantly, it was far enough from any settlement that they could live their lives without constant judgment or fear. They spent that spring and summer working from dawn to dusk, repairing the cabin, clearing fields, planting crops. It was back-breaking labor, but they did it together, and every nail Mara hammered and every seed Garrett planted felt like an investment in their future. By autumn, they had a harvest to bring in, modest but real. They had a home that was tight against the weather and a barn for the animals they hoped to buy next spring. They had each other and they had hope. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over their valley, Mara said, "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your old life, becoming a fugitive, ending up here?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, then said, "Not for a second. That night when I opened your cell door was the first time I felt truly alive. Everything since then, all the fear and struggle and hardship, has been worth it because I get to face it with you." "I feel the same," Mara said softly. "You gave me a life, Garrett, not just by freeing me, but by showing me that I deserved to live, that I could be loved. I spent so long thinking I was a monster, and you looked at me and saw a person worth saving." "You were always worth saving," Garrett said, taking her hand. "I just got lucky enough to be the one who saw it." They sat together as the stars came out, and Mara felt a peace she had never known before. The world was still broken in so many ways. The ceasefire was fragile and might not last. There were still people on both sides who would see their love as wrong or evil. But in this valley, in this moment, none of that mattered. They had each other. They had a home. They had a future. And that was more than enough. Winter came and went, harsh but bearable. Spring returned, bringing new life to their fields and new hope to their hearts. One morning in late spring, Mara woke feeling strange, a flutter in her stomach that she could not quite identify. Over the following weeks, the feeling grew stronger and was accompanied by other changes, until finally she had to acknowledge what her body was telling her. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. Joy, because this child would be a product of love and hope. Fear, because bringing a half-orc child into a world still full of prejudice seemed impossibly daunting. And wonder, because against all odds, she and Garrett were going to create a new life together. When she told Garrett, he went very still, then pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "We're going to have a child," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A baby." "Our baby. Are you happy?" Mara asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy." Garrett pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were shining with tears. "Mara, I am terrified and overwhelmed and more happy than I knew was possible. We're going to be parents." They spent the summer preparing for the baby, building a cradle, gathering supplies, learning everything they could from a midwife in the nearest settlement, who agreed to help them despite some initial hesitation about Mara's heritage. The midwife, an older woman named Joan, turned out to be kind and practical, and she helped ease many of Mara's fears about the pregnancy. "Half-orc babies are usually healthy and strong," Joan assured her. "The birth might be a bit harder on you than an all-orc pregnancy, but your body knows what to do. Trust it." In early winter, on a night when snow fell soft and quiet outside, Mara went into labor. Garrett stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand, supporting her, whispering encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her into this situation. Joan guided them through the process with calm competence, and after hours of pain that felt like it might break her in half, Mara heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It's a girl," Joan said, placing the tiny squalling infant on Mara's chest. "And she's perfect." Mara looked down at her daughter and felt her heart crack open with love. The baby had Garrett's nose and mouth, but Mara's pointed ears, and a faint greenish tint to her skin. Her eyes, when they opened, were amber like Mara's. She was small and fragile and absolutely perfect. "Hello, little one," Mara whispered. "Welcome to the world." Garrett was crying openly, reaching out to touch his daughter's tiny hand with one finger, marveling as the baby reflexively gripped it. "She's so small," he said in wonder. "So perfect. What should we name her?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but now, looking at their daughter, only one felt right. "Hope," Mara said. "Her name is Hope." "Hope Rivers," Garrett agreed. "It's perfect." The first year of Hope's life was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, and the constant worry of new parents, but also first smiles and first laughs, and the incredible joy of watching their daughter discover the world. As Hope grew, it became clear she would have characteristics of both her parents. Her skin remained a light green, pale enough to almost pass for human in dim light, but unmistakably showing her orc heritage in full sun. Her ears were pointed, her build sturdy. She would be strong like her mother and clever like her father, and she would grow up knowing she was loved absolutely and completely. Other children followed in the years that came. A son named Thomas, after the boy they had rescued, who had Garrett's brown hair and Mara's strength. Then twin daughters, Lily and Rose, who were more human in appearance but had Mara's amber eyes. Each child was a blessing, each one a testament to what they had built together. Their homestead grew and prospered. The fields produced good harvests. They built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Other families, drawn by the chance for a fresh start, settled nearby, and gradually a small community formed in the valley. Some were human, some were orc, and some, like Mara and Garrett's family, were mixed. They helped each other and protected each other and built something new together. The ceasefire between the kingdoms gradually became a true peace, fragile and imperfect but real. Trade opened up. The hatred did not disappear, but it began to fade, replaced slowly by understanding and coexistence. It would take generations to truly heal the wounds of the war, but the healing had begun. On Hope's 10th birthday, Mara and Garrett stood together watching their daughter play with her siblings and the other children of the valley, and Garrett said, "Did you ever imagine this? That night in the keep when I opened your cell, did you imagine any of this?" "No," Mara admitted. "That night I was just trying to survive to see another dawn. I couldn't imagine beyond the next few hours, let alone 10 years. "I knew you were special," Garrett said. "From the moment I first heard you speak. You had been beaten and locked in darkness, but your spirit was unbroken. I think that's when I started falling in love with you, though I didn't recognize it then." "You saved my life," Mara said, as she had said many times over the years. "You risked everything for me when you had no reason to, when I was nothing to you but a prisoner." "You were never nothing," Garrett replied. "And I didn't save you, Mara. We saved each other." They watched Hope run past, laughing, her green skin bright in the sun, accepted and loved by the other children who saw her not as different but simply as their friend. And Mara knew that Garrett was right. They had saved each other that night in Greystone Keep, and every day since they had continued to choose each other, to build together, to create something beautiful from the ruins of a broken world. "I love you," Mara said, leaning into Garrett's embrace. "I will love you for as long as I live and beyond." "And I love you," Garrett replied. "Forever and always." The sun set over their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Mara felt a contentment so deep it seemed to resonate in her bones. The journey from that midnight cell door to this moment had been long and hard, filled with fear and danger and sacrifice. But it had also been filled with love and hope, and the gradual building of a life worth living. She had been unlocked that night, freed from more than just a cell. Garrett had unlocked her capacity to hope, to love, to believe in a future she had thought impossible. And together, they had built that future, one day at a time, one choice at a time, proving that love could bridge any divide and that courage could change the world. As the stars began to appear overhead, Hope ran up to them, breathless and happy. "Mama, Papa, come see what we built. We made a fort in the woods." Mara laughed and let her daughter pull her by the hand toward whatever adventure awaited. Garrett followed and their other children joined them, a family complete and whole and perfectly imperfect. And in that moment, surrounded by the love they had created and the life they had built, Mara knew that every moment of struggle had been worth it. She was home. She was loved. She was free. And that was everything.